Distinguished guests and colleagues, it's an honor and a pleasure for me to welcome you to the opening lecture of the academic session 2011 to 2012 in the School of Divinity of the University of Edinburgh. Now, the opening lecture this year is a special event, as it is also the inaugural lecture of Professor Jolyon Mitchell, as he officially begins the work of his personal chair of Communications, Arts, and Religion. Now, I'm Stuart Brown. I'm Professor of Ecclesiastical History and head of the School of Divinity, and in a few moments, I will invite our Vice Principal and head of the College of Humanities and Social Science, Professor Dorothy Meal, to chair Professor Mitchell's inaugural lecture. But first, a few words of welcome. Now, one of the problems with having a church historian as head of the School of Divinity, as my colleagues will attest, is that everyone has to hear a great deal about traditions. Now, one of these traditions, and I think it's an especially valuable one, is the opening lecture in New College. Now, in the autumn of 1850, when this majestic New College building was first opened, each of the professors was invited to give a public lecture to introduce his discipline, and they were all men at that time, to introduce his discipline to a general audience and to explore some of the big ideas that were being discussed in his field. Now, these lectures, these public lectures, were held on a number of consecutive evenings, and all the great and the good of Edinburgh came to hear them. There was great public interest. Now, today we call this knowledge exchange, but then it was part of the Scottish tradition of the democratic intellect and the Edinburgh idea of the civic university. The university in the midst of the city, in the midst of the community. Now, these opening lectures were so successful that New College continued the tradition. And for over 160 years, we have invited a member of the staff to launch each new academic session with a public lecture, while colleagues have processed in their finery to show respect and support. And today's opening lecture will, I'm sure, be an especially memorable one. Now, the opening lecture is also the occasion for a few welcomes from the head of school, and I will be brief. But first, let me welcome our new lecturer in religious studies, Dr. Arku Langkummer, a distinguished scholar of South Asian religion and culture, who is with us now. We're very pleased, and we hope you'll have a long and successful career with us. Second, although her duties at the University of Glasgow mean that she can't join us for the beginning of the lecture, I would like to say how pleased we are that Professor Mona Siddiqui, a renowned scholar of Islam, will be joining us in December as Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Understanding. And she hopes to be here for the reception. Third, allow me to extend a special welcome to our Dartmouth visiting professor, Christopher McEvitt, a respected scholar of medieval religion, and indeed to all of the students of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire who have come so far to be with us this semester. I hope you have a tremendous time with us. And of course, the warmest of welcomes to all our students and staff, and my very best wishes to each of you for a successful and enjoyable academic session. Now, at the end of the lecture, there won't be any questions, but there will be a reception in the Rainey Hall, just outside along the black and white corridor, and to which everyone is most warmly invited. Vice Principal Meal, it is a great honor to have you with us today. And could I now invite you to chair the inaugural lecture of our colleague, Professor Mitchell. Professor Neal.
Thank you very much. Professor Jolyon Mitchell first studied theology at the University of Cambridge. He later went on to take a research MA in modern church history at the University of Durham, and then a PhD here at the University of Edinburgh, where his lead supervisor was Professor Duncan Forrester. Jolyon has worked at the University of Edinburgh for over 17 years as a lecturer and then senior lecturer. Since 2010, he has been the director of the Centre for Theology and Public Issues. He has also held visiting appointments at various institutions, including Dartmouth College in New Hampshire and Ormond College in Melbourne. He has been a visiting fellow at the Centre for Advanced Religious and Theological Studies at the University of Cambridge, and since 2000 has been a life member of Clare Hall there. Earlier this summer, we were all delighted when Jolyon was appointed to the chair of Communications, Arts and Religion here at the University of Edinburgh. Professor Mitchell is the author and co-editor of 5 books, with a new reader on religion, media and culture appearing only last month. 2 more books will be published next year, one entitled Promoting Peace, Inciting Violence, The Role of Religion and Media. He is the co-editor of 3 different book series, most recently one on film and religion. He is also the author of over 60 articles and chapters in edited books on topics such as communication ethics, arts and theology, and film and religion. Since joining the university, he has successfully applied for over 20 different research grants, raising around £500,000 to help fund master's students, PhD and postdoctoral researchers, as well as several international conferences and research projects. A good example of one such project is the 3-year Peace Building Through the Media Arts research project, generously funded by the Binks Trust, which began with the art exhibition Shadows of the Divine, which many of you may remember from earlier this summer. It was a great success and attracted about 4,000 visitors in just 4 weeks here to New College. Before coming to the University of Edinburgh, Professor Mitchell worked as a producer and journalist with the BBC World Service. And whilst here in Edinburgh, he's continued to contribute to many different radio programmes, even producing radio documentaries such as Garrison Keillor's Radio Preachers for Radio 4, and an episode of Meridian on West African video films for the World Service. Like many of his other colleagues at New College, he's been nominated for one of the Students' Association Teaching Awards, has successfully supervised over a dozen PhD students, and regularly lectures outside Edinburgh. It's a real pleasure to see so many people here today to help mark and celebrate Professor Mitchell's appointment to the chair, and to listen as we are about to his inaugural lecture. Not only do we have many distinguished guests, colleagues and students joining us here in New College, but also, very importantly, we have several members of Jolyon's own family. I'd particularly like to mention his wife Claire and their 3 children, Sebastian, Jasmine and Xanthi, who I'm very pleased to see have escaped from school to be with their father on his very important day. I'd like to warmly welcome them and all the other members of Jolyon's family who've been able to join us today. And so now it's with real pleasure that I introduce Professor Jolyon Mitchell to present his inaugural lecture, Swords into Ploughshares, Transforming Arms into Art.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to begin by saying a number of thank yous, of heartfelt thank yous. And actually looking around the room today, I could spend the entire time saying thank you, but I think that might be cheating. So perhaps if I could just say a huge thank you to Claire, to family, to friends, to colleagues, to friends and colleagues, and to you all for coming today, which I really appreciate. I'd like to begin with a walk around the garden in the United Nations in New York. And there, this image, this piece of art, particularly can strike you. Well, hopefully not literally strike you. But there, this shot actually makes me think almost as if the hammer is part of his body. And also the sword almost looks like a tiller, as if he's going down the river Hudson. But also you could walk around and you might see the knotted gun, for example, by a Swedish artist that made this in the 1980s in response to John Lennon's assassination. Or the Japanese peace bell, which has been there donated by the Japanese nation in 1954, before actually Japan became a full member of the United Nations. It's interesting, 40 years afterwards, the then Secretary General, Boutros Ghali, said, peace is precious, it's not enough to yearn for peace. Peace requires work, long, hard, difficult work. Now, those are three of a number of different gifts to the United Nations, and it'd be possible to do a lecture about each of them. We could go inside the building as well, and we could see not the original version of Guernica, but the tapestry version there. And whenever I look at it, I'm struck by new things. For example, the newsprint. I don't know if you can make out in the middle there, the newsprint of one of the ways that he learnt about the bombing in 1937 of that small town in the Basque region and the many people who were killed. Or the broken sword. The sword there is broken and not being repaired. Again, we could spend a whole semester looking at this extraordinary painting, but I'd like to stay with the image I began with for a while, entitled "We Shall Beat Our Swords into Ploughshares" by Jevgeny Viktorovich Vutecic. I'll let you pronounce the last word, or leave it to my dear wife who speaks Russian, unlike I do. And you'll notice that I picked there a shot of this figure that was given by the Soviet Union in 1959 in the snow. Can you just make out the shadow in the snow, partly as a visual reference to the Cold War. Even though Khrushchev was there, he was visiting the States in 1959, but also just as a reminder of the political context when it was given. It's interesting, it's the one place in the United Nations where this phrase is slightly changed, but nevertheless changed from the book of Isaiah. It was by this artist who won the Lenin Prize, the Stalin Prize. He was the People's Artist of the USSR. And it's been interesting looking at other kinds of work that he's put together. For example, this, which I didn't know about until very recently, Soviet War Memorial. I haven't seen, but a friend I know, we talked about it, and I understand it's huge. It's about 10 foot higher than our blacksmith. And it speaks of might. It's actually based on a supposed true story of a Russian soldier who rescued a 3-year-old girl who was dying in the last days of Berlin at the end of the Second World War. But it speaks less of compassion when you're confronted by it, and more of somebody holding a vast sword. It's might. You can maybe just see at the bottom, I don't know if you can see at the bottom there, it's cutting through a swastika. So speaking and celebrating their force and might. Of course, it stands within a socialist, realist tradition of art. The blacksmith here, for example, people of the world, let's reshoe war weapons for arms of work. But it's this image that has stayed with me as I've thought about this question of swords into ploughshares. When I look carefully at that image, I don't think of someone like Excalibur, Arthur pulling out the sword out of the stone, or perhaps Aragorn with a sword that was broken and being restored. No, I think there it almost looks as if it is turning, isn't it, into a plough, and it's cutting its way through the land. He replicated it in other places. So, for example, if you go to Moscow, you'll see it there. And if you did particularly well, you could be given a miniature. I've been trying to find out whether any arms dealers were actually given one of these as a memento to say, well done, but I haven't found that out. But it's interesting when you look at the figure's face, this weather-beaten bronze statue. If you look at the eyes, one eye is in shadow, the other it's almost weeping. Look at the sword. It's a sharp, long sword which is cutting in different ways. It's turning into a plough, but it's also cutting across history. Remember, it's in 1959. It bisects, cuts through, if you like, the 20th century. And of course, the 20th century was far from swords into ploughshares. In fact, perhaps the opposite. There were other kinds of responses to turning swords into ploughshares. You can see, for example, in the First World War, one way of whiling away the time in the trenches was to create trench art. One way of earning a lot of money after the war was to create trench art. These are memorials of different battles as well, made out of former weapons. If you go to West Kilbride Parish Church, it's about an hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes from here. It used to be called St. Bride's Church. You will find this. It's at the bottom of a small memorial window, bottom right corner. It's such a sharp contrast, isn't it? Here's a little angelic figure changing the sword. Already has done. It looks as if it's the little hammers come from Bob the Builder or something. But nevertheless, it's interesting there. This war memorial, and then on the left, 14 names. I've been trying to trace the names and the stories behind them, and haven't found many answers yet. But it is striking how a number of them are within local cemetery in West Kilbride. And you'll find there, what will you find there? That they're commemorated, but their body is, for example, in Flanders. And so this common experience of many people having to grieve, but with no body to grieve over. And so it's not surprising that thousands, literally, of memorials have been placed all over the country, partly as a response to that grief and memorial. One memorial I find impossible to forget is by Kathy Kollwitz, called The Parents. Her son was 18 years old in 1914, was killed, and she was a well-known artist then. She said, I will make a piece as a memorial. But it took her 18 years, another 18 years to create this, which is in the cemetery where he's buried. It's a very striking piece. She talked about it as almost wanting to ask forgiveness of her son for what happened. But this isolated grief is something which I think is interesting to hold in juxtaposition to that mighty figure turning a sword into a ploughshare. I'd like to move now from this discussion, we're still within the introduction, but just to move to reflect on how some popular artists have tried to respond and to wrestle with turning swords into ploughshares. And it's those three words, swords into ploughshares, that I'll be focusing on in particular today. Originating first time in the King James Version of the Bible in 1611, 400 years ago. So the first one, whatever your personal feeling about his music, just bear with it and the music video, and also think about how the text is being used and recycled here. Now, that was Michael Jackson's Heal the World. It's very striking how the images of the guns being thrown down, heal the world piece by piece. Notice also the phrase of see the nations turn their swords into ploughshares. But how realistic is this? Is this just pure fantasy land? Better to keep in a music video where it deserves than actually in the hard reality of the day. Or, for example, as a contrasting approach, look at how in the world's most seen musical, Les Mis, this is out of the 10th, how the phrase is used there. Notice there the future. They will live again in freedom. They will walk behind the ploughshare. They will put away the sword. Again, it's striking how this comes at the end of the musical. It's a reprise, remember, of an angry song, the angry young men who go to the barricades and say, we'll fight. So is this something which is going to happen in the future, or is this something that we can taste now? It's interesting how this phrase provokes scholars as well. In 2005, a group of biblical scholars and international relations scholars went to a villa outside Florence and discussed swords into ploughshares. Sounds a great deal. Why weren't we all there? But anyway, they discussed it. They discussed it both in its biblical historical context, but also its pertinence today, to today's situation. And in 2008, they produced an absolutely fascinating volume of essays on it. But it's interesting in the conclusion where they land. In the conclusion, at least, the two authors, two editors. Isaiah's vision is not a practical manual for bringing peace to a strife-ridden planet. It's an idealized model, the end of the rainbow, to be sought but never attained. What I'd like to do for the rest of the lecture is question that. Question those who would say that it's simply an idealized model, the end of the rainbow. I talked to a number of not peace activists, but people involved in peace building and conflict situations, and they said they wouldn't use this phrase because for them it's hackneyed, it's a cliche. Which is, I was genuinely surprised by that response, but nevertheless it was interesting. And it's better to stay in the land of musicals and the land of music videos. So it's interesting. But I'd also like to argue that this phrase, swords into ploughshares, has both resonance and pertinence in our strife-ridden planet today. And I'm going to do that through focusing on three transformations. The first transformation is this, ploughshares into swords. This is the move, the common move, surprisingly common, of turning farming implements into weapons of violence. This is from a memorial in Texas, in Denton County. It's from Joel 3:10, the reference. And I am ashamed to say I did not know about this reference till I started working on this text, on this lecture. It's a very interesting counterpoint to the Isaiah. It's an inversion. One of the things I did when I first came here was I worked looking at radio preachers, and it's been very interesting looking at how radio preachers are now using new media. And I'm going to play you a short extract from someone I would describe as a radio preacher. So just have a listen and see what he does with the text.
They've got that on the United Nations today. The passage in Isaiah, beat your swords into plowshares. I think they ought to put this verse up there. Beat your plowshares into swords. Be prepared. You're in a bad, bad world.
Bad, bad world. I never, in Hebrew Bible studies, did Joel 3, but it's an interesting thought. I'm assuming that's Joel 3:10. Maybe it was a hidden. I must have missed that lecture. Just looking at it. But actually, it is quite easy. I could set that up. And that would be a straw person to knock down, because it'd be a very easy move to say, well, obviously we don't want to turn our ploughshares into swords. An artist friend called Paul Hobbs, who did this piece of art, which was a response to what went on in Rwanda and Sierra Leone. And it was, you'll know, for example, in Rwanda in 1994, over a period of 100 days, something like 1 million people were killed. Many of them were killed by farm implements, such as this one here. This piece of art he calls in emergency break glass, and he's actually reflecting on fear action. That's what it says on the, and he sort of reflects on the power of fear. This is how he interprets it. This is both a memorial to the tragic bloodletting in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and recently Kenya, and an expression of what fear can drive us to. When I look at that machete, I can't help thinking about the times and choices that were made back in the UN that meant the troops were pulled out of Kigali, and particularly Kigali, but all over the country, and wonder what would have happened if they had stayed. Or this piece of art. If you're from Dartmouth, you may recognize it. I find it haunting, and it's a delight to have you here from Dartmouth College. I found this an absolutely extraordinary piece of work, which is both critical on how the Rwandan genocide was covered. It doesn't show lots of bodies on the floor, but instead simply shows the eyes of Gute Emerata. She was a woman that he met with his translator in Natarama Church, just south of Kigali, and she had had seen her husband and 2 sons killed. She had managed to escape from where she was, from the church, and hide in the swamp with her daughter and survive. And obviously was very, very traumatized. Now, the story there, when I'm confronted by those eyes, it does make me wonder about how do we respond to situations such as in Rwanda? Is it simply to say, well, actually, let's give away the weapons? This is not going to be a lecture about just war. There are people much more qualified to talk about that here. But it is looking particularly at how media arts can provoke and evoke questions about issues such as just war, and also about the coverage of stories such as genocide. Moving on from Rwanda, I'd like to move to another example of some reflections, some musical reflections from a Scottish band on the situation in the 1980s. This is from their album The Cutter and the Clan, Protect and Survive. Notice here, this is almost a satirical critique of what was happening then.
There's a useless cross on a distant hill, a wasted voice and a silent scream for the lovers' love and the dreamer's dream. You stand and dream alone. You took your sacrifice to the gods of war, ridiculous lies from mess of gold. You beat your plowshares into swords, breathing free. Once in a lifetime, you live and love. Once in a lifetime.
You traded your children's lives for a mess of gold and beat your plowshares into swords. So here is a counterpoint, not asking questions about just war, but actually critiquing the movement towards embracing, in that context, nuclear weapons, because of course the title Protect and Survive. I've always wondered what the bunny rabbit is doing there. I have no idea what the bunny rabbit, I don't know if you saw the bunny rabbit in the video. Maybe something to do with some semiotic link between the hair of the rabbit and the hair of the singers. But anyway, that has nothing to do with anything. And finally, final example, the quality of this is not ideal, but the question I find very thought-provoking. What good are plowshares if we use them like swords? Don't spoil the harvest, we ain't got much more. I'm convinced that I know some of these people, but I can't remember from where.
What good are plowshares if we use them like swords? Use them like swords. No spoil harvest. We ain't got much more. No, we ain't got much more.
I'm sure I've seen one of them at a lecture somewhere, but... What good are plowshares if we use them like swords? So again, questioning there, radical questioning of how we use weapons. Or for example, you can find it at the end of the street on Princess Street. It's been going since 1982. This here is a political, and it's interesting how it's been questioned online as well, of observing politically what's happening now in terms of cuts, and yet the ability to fight. So there's the possibility there of radically questioning policies. So to move back to this particular text, from Isaiah, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Isaiah 2:4, and you'll also find it in Micah 3. What's one thing to observe, this is not actually in the United Nations, it's just across the road. It's sometimes described as the Isaiah Wall. And I've been fascinated to learn more about this text. I'm no Hebrew Bible scholar, but have really enjoyed learning from a number of different writers. For example, Hugh Williamson, who taught me as an undergraduate. And I found this book so useful for reminding me of the importance of learning original languages and also thinking about the historical context of texts. It's almost like a literary archaeologist here. So, for example, he points out that in 1 Samuel 13, the Israelites are not allowed to make swords, but for a fee, the Philistines allow them to have their plowshares and hoes sharpened. So here, this is what he argues based on other scholars. Here is evidence of a long-standing tradition of turning tools into weapons. He also points out some striking parallels with some classical texts, such as the Roman poet Virgil. Respect for the plough is gone. Our lands robbed of the tillers lie waste, and curved pruning hooks are forged into straight blades. And you can see there the devastation of the land. This is actually from a very different context, from the allegory of bad government from Lorenzetti. You'll see it in Siena. But nevertheless, you'll see there is nobody ploughing the land there. There are just soldiers walking across past devastated buildings. Hugh Williams also points to this text, which is, I think, a wonderful sort of imaginative leap by what it would be like to be a sickle. Our leaders assured peace, curved me for quiet employments. I'm now the farmers. I used to be the soldiers. So it's interesting imagining what it would be like to be a sickle. This is from the 1st century Latin poet, a creator of the modern epigram. Now, part of the reason I put those up was to underline the historical importance, but for another personal reason. There's one person I'm very sad who can't be here because he's not with us, Mark Birchall. But he was my father-in-law, a great supporter, a great encourager, and someone who loved the classics and loved texts such as this. So I imagine that he might be smiling at the thought of somebody turning from a sword to a sickle. It's interesting where knowledge exchange is found. This is Hugh Williams on the book of Isaiah, again, discussing on YouTube here, significantly observing the historical context. His argument, though, and I find it very persuasive, is that actually the swords into plowshares is innovative and it's a reversal. In other words, what was happening in the situation was it was quite common to say, imagine you were all farming, and I would say, we need to fight. You would all pick up your farming implements and use them as tools of war. So Isaiah, in this context, is reversing that. And this is his argument. It's interesting to think about that. So that's one approach, one way of handling a text. Of course, I haven't talked in detail about thinking about the context in which it's placed. For example, in the first chapter of Isaiah, where Isaiah is highly critical of an elite which seems not to care about the orphans or the poor or the widows. But then another approach to a text, which I found, again, fascinating to learn from. John Sawyer's The Fifth Gospel, Isaiah and the History of Christianity, stands in a tradition where you look at, if you like, not so much the archaeology of a text, but like constructing a biography of it, a story of it. How is it made? And he tracks, for example, how this text was used amongst the early Christian writers, such as Tertullian, Athanasius, and Chrysostom. And because I think it's always good to check, I actually went back and checked the sources to check, and it's interesting, I think his conclusion, I agree with his conclusion, which is to say that these early writers, early Christian writers, used this text figuratively. Who did they see in the text but Christ or the church? What's interesting is he contrasts that with, for example, a Jewish reading of the text, rabbinic text in the 13th century, Rabbi Moses ben Naaman, who in a conversation with King James I of Aragon references this text and actually says, how hard it might be, my Lord and King, if you and your knights, you Christian knights, were not to learn war anymore. So it's interesting in terms of the critique that's going on within that dialogue. And so I think this biographical approach to text, how it's used, is fascinating. Can I just say, if you haven't seen it, do go to this exhibition. It's wonderful. Just absolutely great. I put this up because I really like the canons. I think they're actually, this is an example from the World Psalter based on Psalm 2 and 3, and some people think this might be based on what happened in St Andrews. I guess they're always fighting in St Andrews, but it's interesting seeing there, you'll see the guns being fired off. This is a response partly to the text of Psalm 2 and 3 talking about enemies. So these are a counterexample. These are not ploughs being turned into swords. These are made-for-purpose weapons. Finally, example, but it's a prophetic counterexample. And it's this extraordinary picture, the preaching of Isaiah. It's very rare, and I'm indebted to John Sawyer for pointing this out. It's very rare, and it's very difficult to get hold of this picture, so I'm grateful to the Munich Museum for letting us have this. Small fee for today. But it's very striking how at the center you have Isaiah, the prophet, at the middle. Then you'll see, if you do a close-up, you'll see that he's using the Vulgate, the Latin version of the Bible, translated as he shall judge among the nations and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. I'm using the KJV as a translation. What I find fascinating here, really interesting, is you remember the earlier examples I was using, the music videos, the other popular examples. They all leave out the first half, the idea of God as judge among the nations and rebuking many people. And they just focus on swords into plowshares. Whereas here, this text, this Isaiah, it's as if almost it's a judgment text, as well as a celebration of this, a celebration of the dethroning of the powers. So you'll see exactly that. You can maybe see this cherub. Just out of interest, does this cherub remind you of anything you've seen earlier today? Any thoughts? The stained glass window, yes, it's interesting. When I saw that, I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder whether there's a quotation there. The trouble was we haven't been able to find yet the parish records. They're very, very elusive, so we don't know about West Kilbride. But nevertheless, it's interesting because there's a resemblance, doesn't mean there's a connection, but nevertheless, it's interesting there's some parallel anyway. Or notice here, this extraordinary, it's not just one person beating the weapons, but a gang of them, 2, 4, 6, 7, beating the weapons into. But notice the movement of the picture. It's interesting, isn't it, how it goes from these, all the weapons. He was very good at still lifes, this Flemish painter, but I think it's a very subversive picture indeed. There's something deeply subversive about the text and how it's been handled. I can't quite imagine, I actually naughtily imagine how he would cover this if he was to go there today. It's on there currently in London if you need any weapons. Defence and Security Equipment International is the world's largest fully integrated defence and security exhibition. But I wonder how on earth he might have depicted that as such a fine example of the current weapons market going on in this country as I speak. So that's the end of the first section where I've looked at this idea of ploughs into sword shares. And I've really looked, I suppose, I've tried to provide examples of different responses to ploughs into swords. First, those who would promote it, defend it. Second, those who would perhaps question it, rightly so, because of the reality of suffering. Thirdly, those who might want to subvert it and say, actually, there must be another way. And of course, that's simplifying horribly each of those different categories of the examples. But hopefully you've seen what I've been trying to do in that first section. So I'd like to move on to the second section, the second transformation. And this is really just one example, and it's based on what's happened in Mozambique.
During years of war, Mozambique was flooded with guns from all over the world. The country is now at peace, and the guns are being cut up and made into art.
Que a árvore da vida é mesmo para dar esperança e dar mais vida.
This is the story of how weapons of war have been made into a symbol of peace. Mozambique is a former Portuguese colony in southern Africa. Following the end of the Civil War, artists have been making sculptures out of guns, the same guns that killed over 1 million people during years of conflict in the country. Now, at least some of the guns are being sent back to where they were made in the form of art, to the UK and the British Museum in London.
It's very striking, just to underline from that short extract, of how many weapons came into Mozambique. No weapons were made in Mozambique. They were produced both behind the Iron Curtain and in the West. Something like 7 million weapons now, you will hear, are still remaining, even after 16 years of civil war. Some people argue that society was highly militarized, with something like 70% of people involved in this complex civil war. It wasn't just the AK-47, but a whole range of weapons that were imported that flooded this nation. As a journalist in the BBC, I found that actually it was quite difficult covering this story because it was so complicated, and for some reason we didn't cover it, and also because it was chronic, because it went on and on and on. Certainly talking to some journalists who were covering it for much longer than I ever did. It's also striking how it was, as this local artist describes it, a destructive fire across the nation in many different ways. But when the peace came, who drove the peace? Was it by the political elite working in Rome and other places? Or was it, as Caroline Nordstrom suggests in a fascinating ethnography, was it something very different? Was it actually by a grassroots movement who used drama, poetry, music and art to promote peace, to make violence impossible? This is her argument. It's been criticized, but nevertheless it is very well rehearsed and persuasive in terms of the evidence it provides. So, for example, a local artist, "You must plant flowers instead of bombs" in 1983. What's striking here is, if you move to thinking about the project of transforming arms into tools, led by Bishop Dinis Sengulani, that actually this approach wasn't something as singular as it's sometimes portrayed, as if one person, because he did, in 1992, I think it was, that he was at a reconstruction conference and he was worried at night. He couldn't sleep because of all the weapons that were left buried, and he thought they could be just reused again. And he thought of the passage from Isaiah 2 and Micah, and he began with a team of other people, with Christian Aid and with other local agencies, to actually put together this project. And he suggested, he says again and again in interviews, that having a gun at home is like having a snake under your bed. He argues, we are transforming your guns into ploughshares so you can cultivate your land and get your daily bread. And a number of artists were drawn to work in this area. For example, Phil dos Santos, "I make mostly birds because the bird is a symbol of peace."
Bring your gun and we will exchange it with an instrument of production.
They are matriz. Já deu que chapa esses casos já veio aqui. Chada também.
The way that the project works, we go to the village and they take us to the place where the weapons are.
We have been able to collect more than 500,000 guns. The way to deal with a gun is to cut it in small pieces, neutralize it. Artists took the pieces of these guns and made them into works of art. It was amazing. They came with very creative initiatives. And now we have the Tree of Life.
I don't use guns anymore, just a hoe on my land. And there was story after story of that. That's very kindly provided by the British Museum. You can actually see it there as a longer loop that they have where the Tree of Life and other objects are kept as well. And it's interesting reading the background of these stories that both it celebrates rightly a number of transformations that have taken place of other people whose lives by this project have been assisted. But other scholars have pointed out it's a little bit more complex because of artistic egos. There's some debates about who and how these are made. Nevertheless, it's striking some of the impact that this small project has had both in Mozambique and in other parts.
Eu penso que o povo moçambicano acredita na paz.
A árvore para a cultura africana é um símbolo central. Temos árvores que nos protegem. Nós ficamos debaixo da árvore quando tem sol. Quando chega a época do fruto, tiramos o fruto e nos alimentamos. Sentamos-nos debaixo da sombra da árvore para resolver os nossos problemas. Pedir aos espíritos para que nos deem força e consigam uma paz duradoura.
It's a very powerful reflection on the place of trees, the significance of trees in that cultural context, providing shade from the heat, providing sustenance, being a place where you can actually discuss and debate and also wrestle with what's happened and also think about questions around how you bring about a lasting peace. You'll perhaps remember from 2000 the little girl who was born in the tree in Mozambique. This is her 10 years later, back in the tree where she was born. And interestingly, just in parentheses, the aid rocketed after that moment, after that scene was shown of her being rescued from the tree. So again, interestingly to reflect and compare, on the one hand, you'll see the tree made out of weapons from China, from Germany, from America. They're small weapons. And it's interesting hearing the artist's story saying that actually it was painful making this because they thought about some of the people who perhaps have been killed by these the weapons. And there are other pieces of art that have traveled around different parts of Europe and the world as well. You perhaps know this picture. You perhaps know the Throne of Weapons, one of the best known objects from the collection. I tried to get it here today for us, but the director of the British Museum, the African Galleries, said it's very popular at the moment and it's going on a tour around Perth and stuff, but we're still trying to negotiate it. But he's very interesting reflecting on this piece. You can maybe, I don't know if you can just make out, can you see the two eyes and the mouth where the straps would go? I don't know if you can just make that out. You'll see there that the artist said that he described this as somebody smiling. What's interesting is that Chris Spring, the director of the African Galleries at the British Museum, said no, this for him is someone crying in grief. So it's both pointing back to the pain of what's happened, but also perhaps forwards to a new future for Mozambique. In the British Museum at the moment, it's surrounded by a case. And it's very interesting to contrast the throne, which is surrounded by the case on the one hand, and the tree on the other hand, which is open and more comic, because you'll find little animals made out of guns as well, crawling around it, and birds. But on the case, if you've seen it, you may remember, it's a very striking phrase. It was taken around the country a few years ago, and it was taken into Pentonville Prison. And one of the prisoners responded by this: the most powerful thing you can do is pick up a book, not a gun. So it's interesting looking at the craftsmanship that's gone on to this, as well as the sense of humour that's been put into it and how it's been celebrated. One of the interesting things, as someone who used to work in radio when at the age of cassettes and analog recording, is to think about the transformation that's gone on within radio. So, for example, you perhaps heard somebody's history of the world in 100 objects, which told us history of the world through 100 objects. Number 98 was the Throne of Weapons, and you can still hear the program online. And that's absolutely fascinating, I think, now, because before, when we made a radio program, it really disappeared, except for perhaps into a cassette on the wall in the office. And if you had to find something, it would take ages to find it, whereas now it's almost instantaneously accessible. It's very interesting how now different things that we have perceived as ephemeral now have a legacy. And you can see this in different ways, on the way in which the BBC is promoting legacy. It's interesting to think about how weapons leave legacies as well. So you'll find this on different contexts, whether that's Wikipedia or also on the British Museum tour. It's been used in a number of different contexts to do educational, to draw attention to the fact of the many different weapons, and also to sell if you want to buy some objects. There's the website. CTBI will be sponsoring a number of films at the African Film Festival on this issue of peace building through media arts in November, but we tried very hard to get this from Mozambique, but it's not going to be ready till next year. And this is actually fascinating because it's an example of stop animation filming, where they're trying to turn these tools that have been turned into objects, into people, into a story. And this is telling the story of the artist here, and you'll just see a short moment about his brother, who used to make and show films for them until he was taken away up north in the country for 6 years. So it's a very powerful short piece of filmmaking. This is just a taste of the film that And in Coventry Cathedral, it was taken for Remembrance Sunday, and used there, the throne of weapons. But you might be saying, well, that's all very well, but that's Mozambique. That's one project. Is it really going to contribute to different forms of peace building, to different forms of reconciliation? This is from Coventry Cathedral. Well, I'd like now to invite you to come with me on the third transformation, which is swords into ploughshares. And imagine, if you like, that the text, swords and ploughshares, is being dropped into an ocean, is causing a number of ripples. One of the ripples, I suggest, is actually what happened in Mozambique. And I'm now going to look at a number of different ripples, which obviously they're interacting with, for example, from Cambodia, turning weapons into art. I emailed the artist in charge of this, and she said, yes, she'd been inspired, actually, interestingly, not by Isaiah, but by the Mozambique project. And this trained, it actually employed unemployed youngsters and some students as well into the craft of metalwork, and gave them the opportunity to create and make things. Some of them look more ornate than useful. I'm not sure I'd want to be sitting on that. Or, for example, in Iraq, and I've been unable so far to find out what was the inspiration, whether it was Mozambique or another source for that. The sculptors made out of Iraqi weapons. In the USA, there are, in San Francisco, for example, a man who lost a number of friends to gun crime, was inspired by the text from Isaiah to set up what he calls gun bakes, so people can give in guns, and they get transformed into useful things such as bicycle racks, or into memorials. This one, for example, is a memorial bench. It's made with 130 melted guns in honor of a young couple who were gunned down by an unstable relative. Or perhaps you've heard of the Art of Peace, the charitable trust set up by an artist, and she was inspired again by the text from Isaiah, not from Mozambique, to create angels of peace, to take weapons from the police amnesties and turn them into angels, one of which was actually taken to ground zero for a number of weeks. So those are different examples of how the ripples are operating, working. Of course, there are some people who are using it for economics, perhaps using it into turning it into artifacts to sell, and other people are inspired by other things. This is a dress, you'll see, which weighs about 45 pounds, made of bullets, I believe not live, but also tags as well. And it's based, it's drawn, I was expecting this to be coming out of Mozambique or Isaiah, but actually it comes out of the LYSISTRATA project based on Aristophanes' comedy, the story you'll remember, where the women refused sexual gratification unless the men would stop fighting in the Peloponnesian War. Or, for example, this piece, The Hope for Peace in Armagh, by the French-born American artist, which is about 30 meters high, and there's 78 tanks here, jeeps and various artillery parts. This was his last sort of sculpture, but really challenging what it had done, how it had devastated different parts of the city. And of course, there are those who want to, as I've suggested, use it economically and comically as well. So you'll, for example, see this person using, in the States, using shells for hair dryers. I'm not sure I'd want those. Or the Finn project that used disarmed nuclear missiles that have been turned into objects of art. Of course, what you might say suggests a more peaceful process than religion and war resistance in the Ploughshares movement, found in the Ploughshares movement, the famous movement in the 1980s, that celebrated swords into ploughshares and actually broke in and attempt to disable nuclear missiles as well. Poor Grigoriev, he tried to beat an SS-20 into a ploughshare. Of course, the project is not to be confused with Operation Ploughshare or Project Ploughshare, which was the US and Soviets did. They called them peaceful nuclear explosions. You maybe know about this in the 1960s. It's rather incongruous, that, isn't it? Peaceful nuclear explosions. But the idea was that you might be able to widen the Panama Canal, create a harbour in Alaska, make way for major roads or trails, and use nuclear bombs. I suppose this would be one way of smoothing out a path for the high-speed rail link. We'll certainly do away with some of the inquiries, wouldn't it? But anyway, yes, sorry. But I think this project is the last example of another ripple of Plant the Peace. I find it intriguing. It's set up in Richmond, Virginia, by a couple of artists there, who the local custom was to take clay and put seeds into it. So what they did was they made clay guns as a memorial for each person shot over a period of 9 months. And as the time went on, they made more and more. But you'll notice here, if you notice, that there is some growth going on there. So there's both a memorial and hope. So you'll see on the one side there, the gun, and the other, and what happens to it. So powerful symbolism, artistic symbolism as well. And in our local church, we're involved in St. James in Leith. It was interesting, we tried out this process of receiving from the children guns, toys, and turning it into a manger for Christmas. But actually I was talking to the artist who led that, Carol Marples, and we agreed that maybe it wasn't fully successful, partly because we didn't have an exchange part of it, so that some of the guns went back, and also because perhaps in our congregation some people didn't own guns, perhaps from she said perhaps from Irish backgrounds, simply saying they didn't want to have a toy gun in their house. Or also, she said with a twinkle in her eye, because a bit of a right-on congregation, but I'll let you decide about that. Okay, so that's the third transformation. What I've attempted to do is, in answer to this idea that this is a hackneyed phrase, swords into ploughshares, I've attempted to make a number of different questions of that, interrogations of that. Firstly, by looking into this movement of ploughshares into swords, and we saw how that was both critiqued, questioned, and defended in different contexts, and legitimately so. We've seen in one specific case study in Mozambique, transforming arms into art, and I used a number of different versions from both the BBC, from Christian Aid, from the museum, and you'll see how it was covered in different documentaries. And then finally, we've looked at other examples, other practical examples of attempts to turn swords into ploughshares. And it's interesting just talking that through now and thinking about it sort of on the spot now, I didn't write it, but how there's a tension between, on the one hand, the desire to remember, and on the other, the desire to point forward to a future where peace can be built. So swords into ploughshares. That was the third movement. We began with a picture of this statue, a sculpture rather, in the snow. It's interesting to put it into the spring. But I still find there's something that makes me uneasy about this, because I think any moment he might whack me on the head with his hammer. It's interesting how it was used in another context, how it was picked up in East Germany. You'll remember perhaps that this badge, it was 100,000 were made in 1982, and it was worn by young people, by pastors, by older people, by all sorts of people as a form of protest. A protest partly against the militarization of education. The GDR was bringing in for 14 to 16-year-olds compulsory military studies. So the churches, interestingly, set up a week during November which would be around prayers and around different forms of peace education and peace reflection. One theology professor even commissioned a local blacksmith to actually do the business of turning a sword into a ploughshare in 1983. This has been commemorated in different ways. 30 years ago, it was commemorated here, for example, in a memorial of the actual process and the risks involved in wearing this patch. If you wore this patch, you'd not only have it cut off, but you might the badge taken off. You might also find yourself kicked out of school, out of college, or even losing your job. It's interesting to see how it's been reflected on within a film as well. It's not very well known, but it was launched in the Berlin Film Festival in 1996. It's a very striking film, St. Nicholas's Church, based on the church in Leipzig, where every Monday night people would get together, would gather, a ritual of praying, of listening, of lighting candles. And it's interesting in the film, which is based, and I believe it to be accurate, based on historical, what actually happened, the pastor says, "Put down your rocks." And one of them, I was reading some of the actual accounts, said it's actually quite hard to hold a rock when you're holding both hands with a candle. And the other side, which is then reflected on within the film, and also in reality, the police chief said, "We had everything planned. We were ready for anything." Because there were machine guns on the roofs, they were ready to fire, except candles and prayers. It's interesting, isn't it, as a sort of a counterpoint of how that was overwhelming. And they were waiting for the phone call from Berlin or from Moscow to say fire, and it never came. So it's striking. This is the last picture, and I wanted to use this last picture because I didn't want to finish with the blacksmith, the heroic individual. I wanted to focus both on a text and also a community of people perhaps finding shelter under a tree, relating to a tree, under a tree, but also with the light shining through behind, raising questions, perhaps discussing, perhaps debating, perhaps thinking about how to move forward in turning swords into ploughshares. Part of what I've been trying to do today is not meant to be a conversation finisher, but perhaps more of a conversation beginner. In projects, for example, of peace building through media arts or religion and ethics in the making of war and peace, projects that we're delighted to be hosting and supporting, because those are ways of thinking about how we might do that, perhaps also in our local situations. So, for example, we've been having conversations with the local police and thinking about what is it guns in Scotland? It's not guns in Scotland. It's actually knife crime that's more significant. But when you look at the statistics, it's actually domestic violence. So the weapons used here are hands. So it's interesting thinking about how it might be possible to transform arms, literally arms, into ploughshares. So hopefully if you see this in terms of a conversation starter, rather than in any way meant to be a conversation finisher, that probably is a good place to stop.
Well, I think that was a fantastic inaugural lecture. It had all the right qualities. It gave us a sense of Jolyon's passion for his subject, but also for the breadth of that subject, for the range of areas and expertise that he has, the depth and breadth of his scholarship, but also incredibly accessible to all of us here, no matter what our backgrounds are. And I think the multimedia use, the ranging across so many examples internationally, is something that not only made it a very successful inaugural, but is very very much a representation of what your chair is in, the range of multidisciplinary expertise that he has. And I think I'd like to thank you on behalf of everyone here for such an interesting and engaging inaugural. And I think I'd particularly like to welcome the last part of your talk where you talked about it being a conversation opener. And I'm sure many of us here would like to join in that conversation and see it continue. So now, just to remind you all that there's a reception in the Rainey Hall to which you're all very warmly welcome and invited, and we look forward to continuing that conversation right now. Thank you once again, John.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.